Oh, wait, all these lecture slides are available on the web.
Oh, they are?
How do you go and do that? Yes, so if you go to my web page, there is, this is most definitely true. So if we go to, let's see. Okay, does anyone want to see it, just to prove that we have this thing?
Well, I'm not to prove it, just to know where it is.
Okay, fine. Okay, yes. So this is, I believe, there's a way of getting a window. Oh, I see. What I need to do is to click on this. If I go to my web page, let's go to the course web pages here. If we go to the course web page, what do you see here? You see the lecture notes, the lecture videos, if you want to watch them. And you'll see the lecture notes. See, I have new. Here are my lecture slides. New, and that'll give you the lecture slides. Okay? The old ones are probably not as good. So new, new, and new. So the new ones for these lectures are what is appropriate. Okay? Any questions? So to study, I would recommend you look at the lecture notes. I would recommend you read through the book. I recommend you look at the sample midterm that I put up here. So where is the sample midterm? Here is an old example midterm. Okay? And look at the homeworks, I think, are for relevant kinds of problems or good things. Yes?
Does it say which chapters are covered in the book?
If you go to the course syllabus or lecture schedule,
Okay.
you will see it has exactly what pages you should know about. Okay? So the book pages you should read are these.
Okay, great.
Okay? And that would give you some help with that. Okay? Any questions? Okay, any questions about how you study for the midterm? The midterm is on Thursday. Yes?
How can you get average time complexity?
How do we compute how do we analyze to compute the average time complexity? The short answer is it is in general hard, and it is in general a hard and ugly thing to do. So in general we don't. Okay? Now, is there a time in my notes when I said I did? Let's see. Did I? Yes. Is there anything in here where I said analyze the average complexity? Usually I talk about worst case complexity. Average case complexities, there are issues in trying to analyze it.
I think you mentioned, it was mentioned during class, but you said to go with the right.
Okay. So, so in general, there is, so in general, I don't have a good general answer for that. Okay? The worst case, there are good, well-established tools for. That's why we usually do it. The average case is usually murky, unless you define what you're taking the average over. So quicksort is a good example of an algorithm that is analyzed in its average case. It says any permutations of input are equally likely, and for that, I'm now going to compute the average. Okay? But to analyze average case in general, you need to have some kind of a probability distribution over the inputs. Okay? And then you average it. But this is hard, and I don't do it I don't really do it. Yes?
What are we talking about?
She's talking about how you compute average case complexity, and I think it was just general interest in education. That was the main reason. Okay? Is that right? Okay, good.
It was on old exam.
Oh, on the old exam, I may have given a, on average case, I guess what I was, the other way to think of average case is what usually happens. Okay? And so I think on the problem on the exam, I did give an average case thing. But I want you to figure out what should happen. Okay? And I claim that if you thought about that problem, overwhelmingly it's likely that if the string is at random, this is going to happen. Okay? And that was kind of the idea there. Okay? Any questions? This should not be your biggest concern for this test. Any questions? Okay? So do that, and we'll see you there. Okay, any other questions about anything technically or logistically before I get into the lecture? Okay, so what I'd like to do is to wrap up. My goal for today is to do 2 more dynamic programming tricks, okay? Just to sort of see some of the stuff you can really do if you're clever with this whole dynamic programming thing. And then talk about the sort of heuristic sequence analysis algorithms that are widely used because they're very fast, things like BLAST and FASTA. And that's going to be what I hope to talk about today. Any questions about direction? Okay, so last class we talked about the fact that when you're aligning biological sequences, it is often the case that you don't want to, that one gap, one run of deletions, okay, is one event. And if we charge on a per character basis for it, okay, the longer the gap is, the more we charge for it. A lot of times the desired alignment we want will not show up unless we kind of charge, let's say, more, let's say, a consecutive run of gaps, less than deleting the corresponding number of characters in multiple runs. Okay, I didn't say that very clearly. But it's the kind of a case that, let's say, in many examples, like, let's say, we were talking about the plagiarism example, right? If I have an example of a text here, I have, let's say I have a quote. What's a good quote? Let's say 7 years ago. That's a famous line from a speech, right? And suppose you wrote me your PhD thesis, and I accuse you of plagiarizing from the speech. And you say, why? What do you mean? And I'll say, take a look over here. F-O-U-R. Does everybody see that? Okay. If there are a lot of deletes there, okay, this does not, if there's a delete between every character that you're matching, this is not a good alignment in that case. On the other hand, if your thesis looked like 4 and then you went in the last chapter of the thesis you wrote, and 7 years ago, right, consecutively, there's a large number of deletions between here, but that they come in one gap, right? And this is a much more interesting alignment than the other one is. Does everybody get that basic principle? So we want to find a way to implement search comparison algorithms where we give you a volume discount for your deletions happening in runs. Does everybody get that idea? Okay. And we talked one way about one algorithm about that last time. Okay. Where if we give you arbitrary gap weights, I showed you how to do it using this thing we call the Needleman-Wunsch algorithm. But that one ran in order n cubed time. I reviewed that if you had 2 strings of length n, the time was cubic in n instead of quadratic like all the other dynamic programming algorithms were. Okay? Were there any questions about this algorithm? I'm going to show you another algorithm for a special case of gaps. Okay? But if there are any questions about this one, I will review it. Any questions? Okay, so let's look at a simple algorithm on gaps that's actually going to run in quadratic time, but give us a little more power. Okay? And this is for the gap cost model that we will call affine gaps. Okay? We will say that an affine gap penalty is one where we charge, okay, a cost of A plus B times T for a gap where we delete T consecutive characters. Okay? Now, in the old case, in the normal case, we deleted T consecutive characters, you paid a cost of 1 per deletion. Does everybody agree with that? So that was really, if you think about it, this case. Okay? If I charge B per deletion, the cost of deleting a run of B consecutive things would cost me B times T. Does everybody agree with that? In the model of an affine gap, we're going to say that there are 2 constants, okay, A and B, where we say that every gap will cost us A plus BT. And this, I claim, lets us reward gaps as happening in a discount. okay, in a large run as a discount. Why is that? Suppose A, okay, is big relative to B, okay? Suppose I charge you 100 for starting a gap, and 1 for every character you delete, right? Then the thing that with the scattered characters is never going to be desirable, right? Because to delete 1 character is going to cost you 101. Does everybody see that? Whereas if you have a delete of 100 characters in a row, you're going to be paying a total of 100 for the start of the gap, plus another 100 times 1 for every character we delete. You'd only pay 200 for cost units for 100 characters worth of deletion. Does everybody see that? That if we charge each gap an affine penalty, we can punish people who have lots of gaps by making A large. Does everybody see that? The first deletion will cost you A plus B. Every subsequent deletion will only cost you B, right? Any questions about that? Okay. So how can we find the cheapest alignment where there is an affine gap penalty? Okay? And there's a simple, clever algorithm for that. Actually, where did they go? Come, boom, boom, boom. Okay? A simple dynamic programming algorithm that will still be quadratic, okay, that lets us charge for these affine gaps. And what is the idea here? The idea here is we're going to let, as before, Vij be the optimal edit distance from aligning, as always, the first I characters of my text to the first J characters of my pattern, okay? But I'm going to have other recurrences here to denote other state that we want to remember, okay? So what I'm going to say is the optimal way of editing the first I characters to the first J characters is either going to end on a match, on an insertion, or a deletion. Does everybody see that? So we're going to take the max of these 3 possibilities. We've already been doing that. But what I'm going to do now is compute 3 separate cost matrices. Eij is going to be the optimal cost. Actually, okay, I got these things wrong. I think G is going to be ending on a match. E is going to be ending on a deletion, and F is going to end on an insert. Okay? We're going to compute one matrix Gij, which is the optimal way of ending on a match. If the last character is a match, then what is it that we're going to be doing? We pay the cost of the match of those last 2 characters, plus the cheapest overall way to get before that last character match, right? And that was going to be Vi minus 1, J minus 1. Okay? Any questions? The more interesting question is, what is the optimal way to end on a delete? Okay? If Eij is the cost of ending on a delete, I claim it could be that if we're going to delete the last character from this string, so here's our string, if we're going to delete that last character, the cost of that deletion is going to depend upon whether or not we were already in delete mode. Does this kind of make sense? If I'm doing the optimal alignment between these 2, if I decide to delete that last character, if we're getting an affine gap penalty, the cost of that last character is going to depend upon whether the previous operation was a character deletion, right? Because I'm paying by the gap, right? So what I claim is the right cost for the optimal way of ending I through J on a deletion is the best of 2 possibilities. Either the previous character was also a deletion, okay, in which case we only pay a penalty of B for it, right? Or the optimal way to do it was that this deletion is going to start a new gap, in which case, at that previous point, we ended in something that was not a gap, and we have to pay to start the gap as well, okay? So my claim is I'm going to use the state, these letters, these different matrices I'm computing, to reflect the state of whether or not I have paid the start of gap penalty yet. Does that make sense? And my claim is the best way to end up editing the first I characters into the first J characters, where this is a delete, either the previous operation was also a delete, in which case this was the cost of ending it on a delete, and all I have to pay is the per capita cost. Or it could be that I've decided to start on a, to start a new gap at this point, in which case I'm going to find the best overall cost of ending here, right? And then pay the start penalty and the character delete, the first character deletion penalty. Okay? And the neat thing is this now becomes a constant time operation by just using other dynamic programming matrices to maintain the state. Yes?
Does B accumulate?
B is accumulating.
With EI, J minus?
EIJ is being, okay, so it looks like the way this recurrence is written. This is written in score world, right? Not edit distance world, right? That's why we've got a max here and a max here. Does everybody see that? Right? So the claim is that we're going to play a penalty for each character deletion and each start of gap, right? If we are going to align, EIJ is basically the optimal score ending in delete. If the last character is going to be a delete, and we want to know the optimal way to add the first I characters of this to the first J characters of this, where this ends in a delete, the cost of this is going to depend upon whether the previous operation was a delete or not. Right? Does everybody get that? If the previous character was a delete, EIJ minus 1 was the optimal cost of editing the prefixes while ending in a delete. That's what EIJ is defined, right? VIJ is the optimal way of ending anyway, right? And FIJ, which happens to sit on another slide, okay? Maybe we'll roll it down a little bit. FIJ is the cost of ending on an insert. Okay? The claim is that this is the optimal with no constraint. Okay, this is the best overall. This is the best end on match. This is the best end on delete. And the other was best end on insert. Okay, I know you can't read the writing. But does everybody see what the basic principle is? I'm going to store, the claim is that what I need to know to properly charge what the last character deletion is going to be is going to depend on the previous, the way that the previous character ended. And there were two possibilities. You either ended on a delete or you did not end on a delete. Okay? And the claim is we're going to account for both of those possibilities. How many people see this? How many people don't see this? Okay, let me try one more time. Okay? And let me try to explain this. Because this is actually not that hard once you see it. It's actually, if you program it, this is an easy thing. Yes?
What are we calculating here? Is it the edit distance or the score?
Here we are computing, here the question is, are we computing the edit distance or the score? Here we are computing the score. That is why we've got max. Okay, so to me, algorithmically, they're the same kind of thing. So it's not a different idea. That's why you get confused. But you're right. This is computing a score, a max, right? So we are computing the score with this, right? And what I claim is, we are going to, though, charge now a gap for a deletion using affine gap penalties. We're going to want to pay that when we do a deletion of x characters, we pay bx, a plus bx, as the cost of the deletion of x characters in a row. Does everybody get that idea? That's what we're trying to do, right? Before, when I just had, you take the max of the 3 possible previous values plus the addition. I have no idea how I got to those previous values, right? I only took it, in my dynamic programming matrix. The cost of this square depended upon the value here and here, right? That's no longer true. Because now, if I'm coming through with a deletion, this character deletion is either going to cost me B, or it's going to cost me A plus B, depending upon whether this deletion was the start of a gap. Does everybody see that? So to know how to charge this, I need to know how it got here, okay? Or more told, I have to consider both possibilities, okay? The cheapest way to end with a deletion, okay, is to, is either something that already started with a deletion before this, which is reflected by here, or it did not have a deletion before it. And I'm saying here is where it starts, right? And if it starts, I'm going to pay the cost of starting the gap. And in both cases, the B, if you notice, is outside this parenthesis. So I'm charging the B regardless. Any questions about that? Okay, yes? Let me try repeating it again. So normally, you guys are used to edit distance now, I hope. Okay? And in edit distance, you are telling me the space that you're used to. If I have a string that is of length n, by a string that's length m, I was going to have one dynamic programming matrix, right? Now what I'm going to say is, no. I'm going to now have 3 or 4 different dynamic programming matrices. One is going to compute V. This is the real cost I care about, right? One is going to compute G. This is the match end, right? One is going to compute E, and this is the delete end. And I guess I'm also going to have one called F, right? And this is going to be the insert end, right? And I'm going to fill up all 4 of these matrices. 4 times n squared is what? N squared, right? So it doesn't cost me any more in a big O sense, right? But what I'm claiming now is, now I can keep track of, at every cell in this matrix, ij, I will know the cost, the cheapest way overall of editing those prefixes together, the cheapest way ending up at, in a match, the cheapest way ending in a delete, and the cheapest way ending in an insert. And based on this, now I can compute the costs of something else. Does everybody agree with that? Okay? So it's sort of like, I mean, again, maybe I'm making up a bad example on the fly here. You know, you could imagine, let's say, people's earning potential, right? There's different life paths. Maybe you have $3,000 in the bank, okay, after college. Actually, maybe you have minus $3,000 after college, right? Another possibility was that you ended up you were worth $3,000, but you were in prison. Okay, you've stolen the money, right? Now, which are you better off at that point? Okay, with the extra money in prison or in college degree not having the money? The short answer is I don't know. You can't really tell, but it's clearly a different state, and where you can go from that state is different. Does that kind of make sense? And similarly, the cheapest cost overall almost certainly ends in a match, right? Or it might have ended in a deletion or insertion. Okay, it doesn't really matter what. But the cheapest cost overall is clearly better than, or no worse than, the cheapest cost of ending in a deletion, right? Now, which is it better? To have paid a little bit more and ended in a deletion at some point, or to have gotten a cheaper cost ending not in a deletion? The short answer is I can't tell, right? If the next character you're going to want to do is a deletion, you're better off having spent $1 more to get to this point in deletion mode, right? That's why we have to keep track of both of them. The cost of ending in match mode, in deletion mode, in insertion mode. And the claim is if we know the cheapest way at every point of ending in those modes, now I can properly know what to charge you for the deletion at ij, right? If I want to know the cheapest way to end in this deletion, if I come from deletion mode ij, I only have to pay B. If I come from best overall, best in show mode, okay, where I'm as far as I know, I'm not in deletion mode. Well, if you want to delete something, then darn it, you've got to pay the start of gap and you've got to pay the penalty, right? Which is better? Well, what?
Yes.
The answer is we'll find out, because we're going to take the best of both possibilities, right? Any questions about that? So the neat thing is I am basically encoding the optimal way of ending in each place. Thus I can charge my next move either A plus B or B, depending upon whether I'm starting a gap or not. Any questions about that? How people sort of see it? How people don't see it and have a question? Any questions? Okay. So think about it. This really isn't that hard if you look at it this way. I mean, how much algorithm is it? It's not much algorithm. Boom. Okay. The great thing about dynamic programming is it's just understanding a recurrence. And why is this recurrence here? If you understand what the meanings of what these things are encoding, then I claim if you think about it, it'll make sense. Any questions? So what is the running time of this thing? It's n squared. Why? Because we still have, now we have something like 4 times n squared cells, but each cell is just constant work per cell, right? I'm taking the best of 2 or 3 possibilities, right? Constant work times 4n squared is n squared. Any questions? And this gives me the ability to charge for an affine gap, okay, as I wish. By making I big relative to B, I'm going to want to make you use very few deletions, okay? If I make A big enough, if you delete anything, I might make you want to delete the whole string, right? Any questions? Okay? So this is an example of how by using the right costs, we can drive the alignment to do what we want. And if we're clever with the algorithms, it doesn't make it that much more complicated or expensive. Any questions? Yes?
So how do we decide A and B?
How do you decide A and B? So A and B, the question is how do you decide what A and B are? A and B are dependent upon what your application is. Okay? So we sort of agree that right now, before we came into this class, okay, if you're just doing edit distance, you had decided A was 0 and B was 1, right? Now, in your application, if you want to take advantage of these gap penalties, you want to make A more expensive. And we agree the alignment will change depending upon what you allow. Right? Does everybody agree with that? And, how do you choose the right one? It depends, somewhat application specific. One way is, in practice, how would I do it? I would probably try a bunch of different values, look at the alignments, and see if they're doing what I want. Okay? In the case of biological sequence comparison, the default on an algorithm called FAST-A that we'll talk about later sets A to be 10 and B to be 2, which means that starting a gap is equivalent to 5 deletions. Okay? So that says, it doesn't cost you much more to delete 5 things than it does to delete 1 thing. Right? And that will sort of make it the case that if you have a single base insertion, you will probably instead try to deal with it by a substitution or something like that. Okay? Any questions? Unless there's really a very conserved region, right? So if you think about it, what does this mean? If I have a sequence like this, where everything matches, there is one base insertion. This insertion is going to cost me 12, right? So the only way I'm going to take that, okay, is if I've got a lot of very strong matches around it. Does that make sense? Before, if I had a sequence, if let's say A was equal to 0, if I gave you 2 sequences, you would be perfectly happy to instead delete a lot of things like that so as to leave the match. Right? The character of what you're going to get is going to change. Okay? You're going to work against having short deletions of short gaps if you charge A large enough. Okay? And the question is, make it do what you want it to do. Any questions? Okay? So that's an important point. Okay? We've talked about 2 cases of algorithms with gaps. Okay? One is the case where we allowed arbitrary penalties. That was Needleman 1. That was n cubed. We talked about affine gaps. Okay? A plus bx. And that was n squared. The truth is that what it seems from experience people really want to do is to charge A plus the log of x. And that turns out to be a little bit more complicated to do. Okay? It turns out that you could use the n cubed algorithm, because that is an arbitrary gap penalty, right? But there is a faster algorithm, basically based on binary search, so long as the cost of deleting a gap grows with the length of the gap, right? That's what we mean by convex. Okay? Yes?
Is x start from the beginning of the gap?
Yeah, so the length of the gap is going to be the beginning of the x is the distance from the start of the deletion run to the end of the deletion run. Okay? Any questions?
So this match function includes replace?
Right, so the match function includes substitution or equivalence, right? Just like it's been in everything that we've done so far. If this was a score, maybe we would get 5 if S sub I equals, T sub j, and maybe we would lose 4 if they did not, right?
But it's basically that replacement doesn't have any penalty.
For replacement, the question of whether it has a penalty is we give you points for matches. Remember, a function that's returning a score value for the ith, comparing the ith value of S to the jth value of T. If they're the same, we give them a positive score. If they're different, we'll give them a negative score.
That's penalty.
And that would be a penalty, right? Okay? Now note that this doesn't mind, this is perfectly happy, by the way, doing a long run of substitutions. You know, you may say that if I want to change, you know, A, B, C, D, E to, you know, W, X, Y, Z, Q, it's going to be perfectly happy to pay substitution costs in a row, right? Because the substitution cost is the same wherever it is, right? Yes?
Wouldn't a match come back as negative from match because you're subtracting it?
Okay, so here I have match as being a positive thing,
No, I'm sorry.
okay? So we agree that in this case, if we are living in a score world, this is why it's not interesting. We're living in score world, match gives us points for them being the same, and punishes us for substitution, right?
Yes.
Okay, any questions? Yes?
What does convex mean over there?
Convex is another word I guess I'd use for monotonic. So the questions we would like, if this is the length of the gap, this is the cost of the gap, we would like a function, a well-behaved function, would charge us more the longer the gap is, right? That's what we mean by convex. You could imagine other functions. Let's say we have an evil function, which charges us a lot if the length is a prime number, okay? But otherwise does that, right? It should be clear that optimizing over that cost function is potentially more complicated than a nice, smooth, well-behaved one. And that's really what this is getting at. Any questions? Yes?
So your cost rate decreases as your length increases, right?
No, the total cost of a gap increases with length.
Oh, but
The price per pound, like you go to the store, you buy 2 pounds of salmon. It costs you more than 1 pound of salmon, right? But the second pound costs less than the first pound, right? Does everybody agree with that? That's the world that we're living in. That is a convex function, right?
Yeah.
If you went to the store and they told you, well, wait a second, to buy 17 pounds of salmon will cost less than 16 pounds of salmon. That's when you get frustrated, right? That's not well behaved, right? It's harder to optimize when it's not well behaved and jiggling up and down, right? And but the other costs are monotonic.
So the cost doesn't start at zero, though. That's just an example, right?
Well, usually the cost. Oh, okay, right. So a deletion, a gap of 0 usually costs 0. Okay.
But then there's the jump.
But basically, I mean, in all of our, okay, so what is the cost of the length of the gap? For the, for the affine case, we started at A, right? And then our costs grew linear in length, right? If we started before in the edit distance thing where A was 0, it grew linear in length, right? What we would like is a more general cost function would be one that isn't linear, but decreases more slowly like that, right? That would be a convex case.
Well, doesn't it still start at 8?
Well, it could start whatever you want, okay? The important point is that the longer it goes, you want the relative increase to slow down,
Yes.
okay? And that's what would be dealt with the more complicated algorithm. Any questions? Okay? Any questions? There's more of a gap here than I wanted to talk about. Any questions at all? Okay. So that's the cost of doing gaps. There was one question. Now clear your heads for a minute, because here's a different algorithmic idea that is related. Yeah, question.
Can you go back? You had the O of m n log n m.
Yes. Or mn log nn. That's the cost of the algorithm I haven't shown you for dealing with convex gaps.
Okay.
Okay? Right now, if you say, oh, I have a convex gap penalty, I've got to deal with it, I'll say use Needleman-Wunsch and pay n cubed. Okay? You have to do it based on what I've shown you here, right?
So we don't have to. It didn't make sense to me because you were using basically the same. You're going through everything n squared, so it didn't seem to me that it would be how you got that.
Okay, I didn't go through the details. Trust me on that. What you should believe is I dealt with the case of arbitrary gap penalties. Was the n-cubed algorithm. Okay? You could do any gap penalty that way. Okay? You can do affine gap penalties in n squared, and that I showed you. My claim is that well-behaved gap penalties are in between affine gaps and arbitrary, and the running time happens to also be, if you have a clever enough algorithm. Okay? Any questions? Okay. Let me talk about one other important, this is maybe even a more important dynamic programming trick or issue, which came up. There was a question about this last time. I've given you a bunch of algorithms that are, this will work by the same issue, by the way, arises in Smith-Waterman and edit distance and affine gaps and all this kind of stuff. I give you a string n by m. I ask you to do the dynamic programming on it. How much time does it take for edit distance? And n squared, or n times m in this case, right? And how much memory does it take? N times m memory, right? Or, yeah, okay? Now, my claim is that the quadratic memory will kill you much faster than quadratic time. What happens if you have a program that is slower than you want? What do you do if you need the answer? You wait. Does everybody agree with that? Now, what do you do if you run on a program and it comes back and says out of memory? What do you do?
Buy a bigger
You
computer.
possibly buy a bigger computer. But that does not infinitely work, or if it does work, it's at your expense account, basically. Does everybody agree with that? And you will hit, what I will say, the quadratic memory bound earlier than, will start to become obviously uncomfortable, earlier than the quadratic time bound. Okay? So I come from an era where a gigabyte was a lot of memory. Okay? And if you think about it, 30,000 by 30,000 bytes is about 1 gigabyte, right? So if you're going to say, I have a memory of about a gigabyte, if you need to store an n by n matrix, you can hold something like 30,000 by 30,000 before you start to have problems, right? You may say, no, 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 I've got 4 gigabytes. Well, fine. Now how much bigger can you go up to? 60,000 by 60,000, right? Does everybody agree with that? Now, if on the other hand, I picture that a computer, every computer these days does more than 1 million steps per second, or however you define what an interesting step is, right? You have gigahertz or something like that, right? 1 million squared, 30,000 squared operations at 1 million steps per second only leaves about 1,000 seconds. 1,000 seconds is what, 10 minutes, something like that, 15 minutes? So this is in a ballpark thing that running out of memory is about the same as dynamic programming for 15 minutes, right? So space is the big issue. Does everybody get that idea? The crippling limitation against doing big strings by dynamic programming, or medium-sized strings, is clearly going to be space. Any questions about that? So my question is, if I want to compute the edit distance between two strings, do I need to save an n by n matrix? Okay? And I'm hearing people say no. Why don't I need to save an n by n matrix?
You're always looking up one above or one below, so you just need one row.
Okay. What the claim is, it says, look, if I want to find the edit distance of string S to string T, I don't need to keep the whole matrix, right? I'm going to fill in my matrix like this. Bop, 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 bop. And every time I'm only going to care about this cell, before it, diagonally opposite it, and down. Does everybody agree with that? So if I want to only compute the edit distance, it should be clear I don't need to use n times m memory. Does everybody agree with that? All I need to do is to figure out which is smaller, n and m, and then do my my computations down basically the shorter dimension, right? And the claim is I'm only going to need to keep track of 2 columns at a time. And that will give me the edit distance. Does everybody see that? So this is a big difference if all I care about is the edit distance. Now my question is, what if I care about the alignment? Okay, does everybody see that if I care about edit distance, I am going to be perfectly happy with linear space here? Any questions about that? This should be relatively simple. Okay, so if you don't get it, this is something I want to hear about. Any questions? Now, does everybody see that there is a problem, however, if I want to now recompute the alignment between S and T? Why is that?
It's not necessarily in a line.
You're saying it's not necessarily in a line.
It could be on two opposite sides of the grid that you want to look at.
Well, my way to think about what the problem is the following. If all I have are these two rows, here is the optimal, the end point of my alignment, right? I have to walk backwards in the grid, right? So long as the optimal alignment stayed in here, I'm fine, right? But the moment my parent of the cell takes me out of the last two matrix rows that I had, at this point I no longer know where the parent goes. I can't reconstruct my history back like that. Does everybody see that? So the problem is I can't reconstruct my alignment in this manner. I can compute what the cost is, the optimal cost, but I can't reconstruct the alignment. Okay? Any questions? How many people see that and believe it is hopeless? Okay, the interesting thing is it is not hopeless. If we are very, very clever, we can, in fact, continue to reconstruct the alignment in quadratic time. And you may say, well, how can we do it? Where did it go? We do not know who our parent is. My claim is that we can do it in a clever way by reconstructing the path in a kind of nonlinear way. Okay? Here's a bunch of words on it. But let me try to explain it. I think if I explain the picture, you may understand it better. What we're going to do now is we want to figure out how little of the matrix do we need to enable us to reconstruct the path in an interesting way. Okay? And what we're going to do now is we're going to keep track of we're going to do the same trick that we did before, which is only compute one column at a time. Okay? You keep track of the last two columns, so that's only still going to take linear memory, right? But in each cell, I am going to keep track of three things. Before, I kept track of field of what is the cost of this cell, right? And what was the parent, right? Those are the two things I'd already kept track of. I am now going to keep track of what is the crossing row. So I'm now going to have three variables for each cell in my matrix. What is the crossing row? I'm going to look at the middle column here of my matrix. Right? Here I've got a middle column. For every cell, okay, what I'm going to say is, whenever I compute the cell here, okay, there's going to be a cell in a middle column. Right? Okay, let's open it. These cells over here never relied on the middle column, right? So they never crossed the middle column yet. We don't care about this value of the crossing row for them. What we're going to be interested in is, for every cell on this side of the matrix, I'm going to want to know what row did it cross the column? Did it cross the middle column? Okay? If we think about it, think about this middle column as the Mississippi River, right? You want to get between New York, here's New York, and here is, let's say, San Francisco, right? Along the way you crossed the Mississippi River, right? You took a bridge to get across the Mississippi River. There are hundreds of bridges across the Mississippi River, right? But the optimal path took one of those bridges. Does everybody agree with that? Suppose in computing the shortest path from New York to San Francisco, we keep track for all these cells of which bridge it used to cross. Okay? Now, what do we know at this point? Okay, I'm now reading this from right to left. My claim is I know the cheapest delay, the distance from New York to San Francisco, right? And I know what bridge you used to cross, right? I know one edge in the middle of your path, right? How can I now reconstruct the rest of the path? Okay? I claim if I compute now what is the shortest path from that bridge to San Francisco and the shortest path from New York to that bridge, okay? I claim the shortest path from here to there is going to be the shortest path from here to that bridge plus the shortest path from that bridge to here. Does everybody agree with that?
Yeah.
So what I'm going to do now is keep track of the crossing row. And now that I have it, I now know the alignment, the cost of aligning one string to another, and I know what row did it cross at in the middle. I am now going to recursively recompute the path from here to there and from here to there. Does everybody see that? The interesting thing to note is, no matter what the crossing row is, I threw out half the matrix the second time. Okay? Does everybody see that idea? And so what's kind of neat is, now I'm going to do the same thing recursively. When I computed this matrix, I am going to find out where did you cross this row, right? Oh, you crossed it over here. What about on this one? Oh, you crossed it over here. Now what I'm interested in is what is the paths from here to here and here to here. Does everybody see that? In each iteration, the matrix that I'm recomputing is half as big. Does everybody see that? So what is the cost of something if I have x plus x over 2 plus x over 4 plus x over 8 dot dot dot? There's a geometric series, right? The sum of a geometric series had this free, sort of free lunch property. That the sum of x, over 2 to the I was twice x, right? It was still order x. So what's neat about this is, if I do this, all my recomputations will be linear in the number of cells, in the cost it took to compute the original edit matrix. Okay? How many people sort of see this? Okay? People see this one. This is harder than the other one to see. Okay? So let's just double check that, because this is kind of cool. Hopefully this will work. Here I've got the edit distance. I want to compute the edit distance of string S to string T. Right? I looked at the middle column. I found out what was the optimal crossing row in computing this, because for every cell on this half, I kept track of what was the crossing column, the crossing row, right? The crossing row, when I computed this cell, remember, right? If I took the path from here, what was my crossing row going to be? It was the same crossing row as my parent, right? So I can update the crossing rows here for each one of these cells in constant time, right? Once I have that crossing row, the clever thing that I can do is now my problem reduces to computing the distance, the optimal path from here to there, I'm going to find what was the middle crossing. What was the middle crossing? I'm then going to recur and find out what was the middle crossing and the middle crossing. I'm going to recur what was the middle crossing, what was the middle crossing. Does everybody see this? And I'm going to slowly piece in every path that I have, every part of my path. And then I will know what was the optimal alignment from here to there. Okay? Any questions? So this is a good trick. This enables me to reconstruct the alignment in linear time, in linear space, linear in the matrix, n times m. Okay? And I get both the optimal alignment and the optimal path. Any questions about that? Okay? So this is a clever thing. Any questions? Okay?
For calculating these bit points, we have to keep track of more than 2 columns at a time, right?
For calculating the midpoints, the important thing is that if this is going, what is the midpoint going to be? If this is from 1 to n, what is the midpoint going to be? And by 2. So calculating the midpoint is not hard, right? What's the midpoint over here going to be?
No. What I meant was like the crossover point.
So what you're going to do is for every cell on this half of the divide, you're going to keep track of what was the crossover point of the cheapest path to this cell. That's what I'm doing, right? And the cheapest crossover path point for this element is going to be, well, this element here is going to be the min of 3 possible paths. It came from somebody, right? If that somebody is still on the right half, I share the same crossover point as this one does, right? If I am actually on the coming from a cell that is on the middle crossover, right? Then my crossover point is the name of the cell that was there, right? So on the cases where I'm right at the line, I have to actually initialize it. On this side, I'm just propagating it, okay? And now I have this. So now when I get back here, you'll tell me which row it is that I crossed over at. I now know where to recur. Yes?
It seems like you have to get to the bottom right before you can do the...
Recursion.
Right, but in order to get to the
No.
bottom right, don't you have to have all...
No. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is I am going to compute to the bottom right, learning essentially nothing but the cost of this, right? And what was the middle crossing point, right? That's what I will learn from this cell. I will look up and say, the optimal path, which you don't see, crossed over at this point, right? Then I'm going to recur on the subproblems from here and there.
No, but to get that optimum value, don't you have to have the grid to...
Right, so I'm first going to compute the entire grid.
Oh, okay.
Then I'm going to recompute the two quadrants.
But then the space will be quadratic, right? If you compute.
No, the space will not be quadratic. The space will be linear.
So it's actually supposed to be done like this, right? So I try to come from the 1 to middle and middle to end, and then I take the min of that.
Wait, say that again?
So I come from, my crossover point could be anywhere on that edge.
Yeah.
I just select the min of that, and then I recur over these two.
Right, no. In the course of propagating through what my parents are, I'm just going to keep track of what was the middle crossing row, right? This cell will know what its cost is, it will know what its parent is, and it will know what bridge its ancestors took to get across the Mississippi River, right? Now that it knows that, it says, if I want to reconstruct my journey, I know what the midpoint is, recursively do the same thing on these two submatrices, right? I'm doing some work over again, okay? But it's half as big. And after that, I've got another bridge that my ancestors took in each quadrant. And I'm going to keep recurring, yes? Well, at each step, the first one took n squared space. The second one took half as much space, right? And now I've got this and this chunk done, right? And then I'm going to recur again. And I'm going to take half as much space again. Does everybody see that? And then I'm going to recur again and take half as much space again until I basically know the entire path.
I mean, I'm guessing that I don't completely understand what you're saying, because it just seems like in the end, there's no advantage, because you still have n times m space.
No, I am not using n times m space because I am throwing. Okay, the reason it's not n times m space, the amount of the matrix that is potentially interesting to me is still n times m. But I am never going to do anything except keep track of, like before. You had no problems with me just keeping track of the last two rows if I wanted to keep track of the cost. Right?
Okay, so when you recompute the smaller squares, it's not that space, it's just linear space.
Right, it's going to be linear space in the smaller squares. I think I now see what the confusion is, right? So this is going to tell me where did I cross. I am now going to conceptually be interested in this matrix and this matrix, but I'm only going to be computing using the space for two columns in these submatrices.
You don't compute score at every recurrence. Okay.
Right, I'm recomputing the score at every recurrence again. But with the score, I'm getting another link in my chain, right? Yes.
So what I'm getting at, you're looking at it as starting from the whole thing, but what you're actually doing is when you grow, you're only keeping track of the crossover.
I'm only keeping track of the crossover and then reconstructing the rest of the path. Once I know that this is the bridge I crossed the Mississippi, nothing in here is ever going to be interesting to me. Nothing in here is ever going to be interesting in me.
I think the confusion is the fact that you're starting with the whole thing first.
I'm starting with the whole thing, but I'm computing it in linear space because I'm just keep interested in this. The only thing I'm interested in here is my score and what the name of the bridge was.
Right, to get that score.
I had to compute the whole thing, but there's a way to compute it in linear space, just getting the score. Remember, if all I wanted was a score, I could just keep track of two columns. Right? Remember, how did I do that? I'm just going to keep track of two columns, right? And throw out each column once I'm finished, because I don't care about these columns when I'm filling in these cells.
I get you.
Yes?
Then going down in the recursion, do we need to recompute the score? Because we originally computed the score for every cell. Do we need to recompute the alignment?
Okay, do I need to score the alignment at each place? One answer is to say it doesn't matter because it's just a constant multiple of memory. I think you need it at most of the cells in order to make the right decision to reconstruct the path.
But we have already computed.
No, but you computed it and threw it away. Okay? So you need to recompute it. Okay? And so, yes, you do need that. Any questions? Yes?
Where you cross n by 2, you are not worried about that quadrant, the one below.
Which one? Right. Once I know that this is the bridge I'm in, I'm never going to...
Should we also consider where you crossed n by 4, because it could be...
Oh, yes, but when I crossed n by 4, I couldn't have crossed n by 4 here. Why? Because all my edit distance paths, remember, come from these directions. There's no way I can come down here and go back up that way, right? And that's why I can throw out that quadrant. Any questions? Yes?
So we reduce the space to linear. And what about the time complexity?
I have reduced the space to linear, and my time complexity is still n squared because of this. Okay? The first set of computations I do took n times m, right? The second set of things I did covered half that matrix, right? which was n times m over 2. So I paid n times m plus n times m over 2. Next time it's going to cost me n times m over 4, right? The sum of that is going to be 2 times n times m. Okay? Any questions? Okay? So this is clever. Okay, it took longer than I wanted to talk about, but it is clever. Does everybody see why it's clever? Any questions? Okay? And this is very much for a practical alignment algorithm. You know, if you're dealing with large strings, this is what you got to do. Okay. But if you're dealing with really, really large strings, quadratic algorithms are not going to work. Okay? There was somebody, when the human genome and the mouse genome were first sequenced. We are a lot like mice, right? That's why we do experiments on mice. The first thing that people wanted to do was to find the alignment between the mouse and the human. That was essentially a 3 billion by 3 billion string. If you assume that we have a very fast computer, 3 billion squared operations would take 285 years. Okay? So when you're doing full genome comparisons for mammals or search against the whole database, this is doomed to not work. Does everybody see that? Okay? So for modest size, comparing one gene to another, Smith-Waterman, yes. Comparing one whole organism to another whole organism. Maybe for a bacteria, but more likely you're going to have to start using a heuristic algorithm. So when we run BLAST, you're going to do that on the homework. There is somebody giving you access to their computer to say run BLAST on them. They're not going to give it to you for 285 years, right? You've got to somehow compare against every sequence in the entire database and do this fast, okay? So the amazing thing is that there are heuristic algorithms with the property that they will find, you give them a gene, they will find you a small set of sequences which look like about the closest matches to what you have in the database. They offer you no guarantee they find the absolute best one. But Google, if you think about it, offers you no guarantee that they're going to give you the best page, right? You type in something for the query. There's no guarantee from Google saying we're finding you the best page. We are finding you pages Google's finding you. That's what Google is promising you, right? And they are good enough that you're basically happy with them, right? So in a similar notion, we're going to use heuristics to do large-scale sequence analysis. Any questions? So let's talk briefly about how these heuristics work, okay? Because they are important. One of them, the simpler conceptual heuristic, is something called FASTA. What it's going to say is, gee, how might I compare quickly my sequence? Here's my input sequence, and here is my database of a zillion sequences. Right? I can spend a lot of time to organize my database sequences so I can answer your query reasonably fast. So what do? They will say, look, if your sequence matches something in the database, for us to find it, there's going to have to be at least one reasonably long exact match. Okay? If the sequences are similar enough that there is a reasonably long exact match, then maybe we can use some of our exact matching indexing ideas for it. Right? We could conceivably build a suffix array or a suffix tree on all of these, right? And then match every suffix of here to see where was there a long enough match. Does everybody get that idea? And if a long enough match is unusual, there's going to be very few sequences in which that kind of thing is going to occur. So this is the idea behind FASTA. We're going to build an index and then check every sequence of length k to see which sequences in my database have the exact k-mer as this. Okay? If I have a sequence in the database that has a lot of k-mer matches with this, that's probably one to investigate more closely. Does everybody get that idea? My goal is to take my 100 billion sequences from GenBank and reduce it to 1,000 sequences so I can do a more exact comparison. Does everybody agree with that? And I claim that by building essentially a hash table or buckets, I can bucket the sequences by every, in this case, 6-mer of DNA. How many 6-mers of DNA are there? 4 to the 6. How much is 4 to the 6? 4,000, right? So the probability that if you have two sequences of length 4,000 that are random, maybe they'll have about one 12-mer in common, right? But if I find sequences that have 6 or 7 12-mers in common, these are worth investigating. And it shouldn't happen too much by chance, and then I can do my dynamic programming or something like that on what remains. Does that make sense? This would be how does Google try to find out what document is most like what you want? You type in a bunch of words, and it says, oh, which sequence has which file out there has the most words in common with what you gave me, right? You type Skiena, exam, answers, right? You want to see which files there have that, right? What you're going to end up getting is my 373 exam, my 114 exam, not my 549 exam, so don't worry about that. Okay? And that's a similar idea as FASTA. Any questions about that? Does that kind of make sense? It gets more and more efficient the longer I let k be. Does everybody get that idea? If I make k equal to 100, it's very, very few sequences are going to have 100-mer in common, right? So that will be very efficient. That's like a hash table lookup. The downside is, if I do that, it's going to not be very sensitive. It's only going to be interested in sequences that align with a big chunk in common. So there's a trade-off between sensitivity and accuracy and efficiency. Does everybody get that idea? Okay, that is FASTA. BLAST is a similar heuristic that works in a slightly more clever way, okay, which is the following kind of an idea. What it's going to do is it is going to organize the database essentially as one long string. It's going to take your query, okay, and break it into short k-mers, but instead of demanding that all k-mers, demanding an exact match of a k-mer, what it's going to do is it's going to ask, where does a k-mer match within a distance of t? So if I have a particular k-mer q, let's say A, D, T, C, C, right? How many strings are there that are within one substitution of this? Well, 3 by substituting in the first character, plus 3 by substituting in the second character, right? 3 times 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 18 strings lie within one substitution of this, right? I could build an automata that has all 18 of those patterns in it, right? And now these are going to be the set of dirty words. Remember we talked about the world where you have a predefined set of dirty words? Now I'm going to run the sequence through it, okay? And wherever one of these dirty words is found, that is a likelihood that that pattern is in the text. Does that make sense? And again, I find where the best matches are, and that's what I would be using. Any questions about that? Yes?
What's a k-mer?
A k-mer is a string of length k.
Oh.
Okay? So this is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-mer. Okay? Any questions? Sorry about that. Okay? So again, what this is going to do, the neat thing about this is I can use much longer windows, but because I'm allowing mismatches, I still get good sensitivity. Okay? And in general, BLAST works very well. BLAST is more popular than FastA. Okay? Any questions? Okay? So the neat thing about this is that with these kind of heuristics, you can basically quickly window it down to a small number of sequences that are interesting. And then you can do your Smith-Waterman or something like that to find where the right alignments are. Does that make sense? Okay? And that is really how sequence matching works in practice. Any questions? Yes?
Is there a tool which combines both BLAST and Smith-Waterman?
So that they combine BLAST and Smith-Waterman? It would not surprise me if BLAST does allow you, we'll say, what do you want to do for your second order matching? They probably give you some choice with that. Okay? So the basic thing I think of this is this index thing is to window down where the match might be interesting. If it's a small amount, you can spend a lot of time trying to do it right from then on. And that's kind of what we hope to have happening. Any question? So Google is a combination of brutal things to eliminate 99.9999999% of the internet, and then clever things to decide which are the top 10 of what's left, right? And that's exactly what we want to do here. Any questions? Okay, we're running out of time. There is one aspect of BLAST I do want to talk about. Again, there's different variants of what parameters you can set. That I claim you'll figure out when you do your homework. So that I'm not going to worry too much about. There is one thing that is very, very clever about BLAST that wouldn't be immediately obvious, which is that BLAST has figured out a way to come up with a significance of a score. Okay? You're going to come back and get a score on your exam. I got a 63. Is that good or bad? Well, in a curved world, you don't know, right? It depends what your neighbors did, right? You need a question. If I give you a Smith-Waterman score, and you got a score of 63, is that good or bad?
Yes.
Okay? It depends upon, to a certain extent, how much data you have. You need some kind of a way to map that score into a significance. Does that kind of make sense? And there's a clever way that they do that in BLAST that I just want to review, because it's kind of, when you look at your BLAST results, this is kind of interesting. What they do is they use some combinatorics to compute something they call an expect value. An expect value is, what is the expected number of matches to this quality that I would get if I gave you a random query, right? If I tell you how many times does A occur in a sequence, well, it occur in all of them, right? What's the expected number of times that ACGTTTGT22 occurs? It's going to be much less. Does everybody agree with that? But for any length pattern I claim, there is a certain expected number of times it would occur by chance. And what I claim is it's better for us to think in terms of the meaning of score, in terms of what is the likelihood a score this good could occur by chance, right? So if you came back and said, hey, I got a 50% on my midterm, if the things were true-false questions, okay, you would have gotten that score by chance, right? Okay? So the question is really, the significance is how likely is it that you did better than chance, right? So let's look at how they do this in BLAST, and then I promise I'll end for the day. Okay? So they use this idea of a significant score, okay? And what they say is the following kind of a formula is what governs sort of what is the expected number of times a pattern should occur with this score. Okay? If you've got a string of length n and a string aligned to a string of length m, what is the expected number of matches, okay, of a score at least S? The claim is it follows something like this, okay? N times M times something decreasing exponentially with the score. If you look at e to the minus something times score, the longer the score is, you increase the score by a little bit. By 1, it divides the expected number of matches by e. Is that right? So what does this mean? The score, I don't know where it came from, but it makes sense. Why is it? If I double the length of one of my strings, how many expected matches should I have? What should happen to the expected number of matches?